Hi, welcome. My name is Martha Works. I'm with the Geography Department here at Portland State, and welcome to the Sustainable Solutions Seminar for winter term. This is a speaker series co-sponsored by the School of the Environment, the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and the Department of Architecture. Tonight's panel presentation is around the theme of financing the Intertwine, a regional conservation strategy. And our panelists include Mike Houck, the director of the Urban Greenspaces Institute, Jim Desmond, director of Metro Sustainability Center, Brent Davies, Ecotrust vice president of Forest and Ecosystem Services, and the panel moderator will be Dan Vizzini of the Portland Bureau of Environmental Services.
Thank you, and welcome to this presentation this evening. We hope to get through it in time to get questions before and some discussion before the class lets out. But for the next 90 minutes, we're going to engage in the discussion about financing an integrated and comprehensive conservation strategy for the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan region. The goal of the strategy is to ensure that people and wildlife continue to flourish together on the urban and rural landscapes of this region for generations to come. And the success of that strategy depends on a collective commitment to financial investments and support for resource conservation sustained over decades and across political boundaries. It's quite a challenge. The financing needs to be robust enough to underwrite the cost of planning, acquisition, restoration, and long-term stewardship. And it has to be flexible enough to allow for investments to go where they can produce the most significant and lasting conservation outcomes for the region. So it's quite a daunting task. The way the evening's going to work is we're going to start with Mike Houck, who's going to describe the Intertwine and the conservation strategy. And if you haven't bought his book yet, Wild in the City, you should. That's a plug.
Wild in the City, Exploring the Intertwine.
Ah, very good. And then he'll be followed by Jim Desmond, who will describe the kinds of strategies that are being discussed and looked at. And then finally, Brent is going to describe some market-based financing tools that may or may not have a place in the region, and sort of the conditions under which they could play a role. So, and then my job is just to keep things moving along and to field your questions or direct your questions when we get to that point. So, Mike, take it away.
Yeah, I was given 8 minutes to accomplish this, so when you hear the ducks start quacking, that's when I'm done. So this will be a very, very quick contextual presentation. People ask where the concept for the Intertwine came from, the Intertwine being the Portland-Vancouver region's network of parks, trails, and natural areas. And people laugh sometimes when I say, start with this fellow, John Charles Olmsted, who was brought here by the Citizen Park Board in 1903. He advocated the creation of a comprehensive interconnected park system for the city of Portland. But interestingly, if you go back and read the document, it's got some incredibly inspiring and I think unbelievably prescient comments in it, such as using streams and rivers as the armature of our park system. And he makes a statement that if we don't let waterways carry their natural floodwaters, there may be a hue and cry to put them into large underground conduits at great public expense. That's 1903, and very much, I think, the focus of this evening's conversation. We're fortunate, and again, going through the history, in 1988, 89, 90, Joe Porosky in the Geography Department, a very probably poorly paid grad student, took these color infrared photos of the Portland-Vancouver region and created for the first time a map showing all the remaining natural areas in the four-county region. For the first time, 1989, 1990. Actually 5 different times, starting back about 1990. We brought David Good, who is director of the London Ecology Unit, to Portland to share what they had been doing in London and learned a hell of a lot from David and his colleagues about how we could put together a similar effort here. In 1992, and this is actually pretty remarkable, because we started this effort at Metro in '88, and within 4 years, we had a master plan for the Portland-Vancouver region adopted by the Metro Council. I don't know how many of you are engaged in public policy work. That's damn fast. And this is what we said we were going to do, create a regional system of natural areas, open space, trails, and greenways for wildlife, and very importantly for people. And it was then known as the Metropolitan Greenspaces Program. And a lot of us were told when we started this work that urban biodiversity is an oxymoron, but if you in fact look inside the metropolitan region at the appropriate scale, everything in yellow has very high species richness, and that's inside the urban growth boundary. I won't go into this map, that's not critical, but I'd love to share the concept with you someday. The point being that even we're sitting right about here. Here's Ross Island, here's Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. Those are the kinds of critters that you can see out there. I've seen 110 species of birds just at Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge since I've been involved. Metro has passed 2 regional bond measures as part of this effort for a total of $363 million, with which they've been buying these kinds of landscapes. And Jim can talk more about the challenges of actually managing that land once they've acquired it. In fact, everything you see in red, Jim, is it 12,000 or 15,000?
12,000 we bought with the bond measures, 3 that came from Multnomah County, so total 15,000.
Okay, total of 15,000 acres. And there's a lot of other stuff in here, of course, that was already in public ownership, but that's pretty damn impressive over the last, since 1995. But the city of Portland and other local jurisdictions have been doing their own work. This is an aerial I took of Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. This is Salmon Creek Greenway in Vancouver, Clark County, which is part of the system. In 2007, we're very fortunate to have had a leadership of David Bragdon, who is president of the Metro Council. Metro is the only directly elected regional government in the country. Very unique, very important tool for us to utilize to try to come up with a regional strategy. Well, in 2007, he brought Mayor Richard Daley from Chicago and a bunch of other heavy hitters from around the country and basically laid down the gauntlet to say, is Chicago going to be a greener city than Portland or the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan region? And the Intertwine, the evolution of the concept of the Intertwine and the Intertwine Alliance is our response to that. And in fact, what started as what we called Connecting Green became, this is our logo, and the Intertwine is the system of parks, trails, and natural areas. That's the vision. Very similar to the Metropolitan Greenspaces vision that was adopted back in 1989. And the system drives economy and tourism. I love this image. This guy's a stockbroker. He was on his way to work, got in his boat at River Place Marina, caught a 24-pound Chinook salmon. There he is in his boat. An Oregonian photographer captured this image. Cover of the Oregonian in many papers across the country. Wyden and Kennedy would be hard-pressed to come up with an image that makes the nexus between economic prosperity and ecological health. It's about increasing property values, promoting human health, fitness, and well-being, supporting an ecologically sustainable region, and the system is actually considered part of our infrastructure, our green infrastructure, all the way from 2,000-acre Smith and Bybee Lakes down to these bump outs in northeast Siskiyou to infiltrate stormwater. There is the Intertwine Alliance, which we have our director, our executive over here, Mike Wetter. Mike, you want to raise your hand? You can grab him later to find out how you can become a partner. Was launched officially as a 501c3 in July of this past year. Those are some of the partners that we have. You'll look up and see some unusual partners that have heretofore not been engaged. Keen Footwear, Kaiser Permanente, Columbia Sportswear, outfits like that. These are the initiatives that we're engaged in the Alliance, one of which is conservation. And under conservation, actually, I'll back up. Under the regional system, there's the regional trail system. We've actually produced a trail plan, a bi-state regional trail plan for the Portland-Vancouver region. So the idea is to connect all these areas. But we're also working on this regional conservation strategy. This is the geography. Should back up. This is the geography we're talking about. North Fork of the Lewis River in Clark County, confluence of the Malala and Pudding Rivers to the south, foothills of the Coast Range to the foothills of the Cascades. And we chose that geography very intentionally to be nested in other work that's going on with the feds in the Cascades, Forest Service, and to the west in Tillamook Forest, and to the north in the Puget Trough. I just love this image. I threw this in simply because I saw it today. Tommy Albo and Jim Shop at Metro put this together. This shows elevational changes, and that's, again, the footprint or the geography of the region, going from the lowlands up into the up into the mountains. And we have a regional conservation strategy. I'm actually holding it up. I'm supposed to be writing the summary, which will get done soon. But you'll notice two of the chapters, one is ecosystem services and green infrastructure, the other is funding initiatives. So that's very much a part of the regional strategy, is how do we put those together on the ground. And I'll finish by simply saying that we're not just working in the Portland-Vancouver region. We have been working with Chicago Wilderness, Amigos de los Rios in LA, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, Sweetwater in Wisconsin, and Houston Wilderness, and in the Bay Area. So we're doing this at the national level to try to focus federal money to come into these metropolitan regions to help us do some of that work. So the point of the Intertwine Alliance is to make the pie bigger, not fight over very limited resources. And we're hopeful that in addition to whatever strategies we can come up locally regarding ecosystem services, green infrastructure, we can attract some federal funds as well to help us do that work. How'd I do? Whoop. And actually, that effort, we're actually looking at mega regions around the U.S. and trying to make sure we've got representatives from each of these mega regions, including we're talking to Orlando and some other areas as well. And there's the duck. I'm done. And that's the website. We just announced it, released version 2.0 a week and a half ago. Check out the website. It's still not perfect, but it's pretty damn good, and it will give you a very clear idea of what the Intertwine Alliance is up to. I can't believe I did that in 8 minutes.
Excellent job. Excellent job. Before we move on to Jim, one or two questions people might have of Mike. He did a very fast flyby of a pretty remarkable bit of history for the region. Any questions, one or two questions? Just come up to the mic if you have
or rebuttals.
One. And then we'll move on to Jim.
What's the southern boundary again?
Well, the southern boundary, first of all, the regional conservation strategy, I don't know that we've ever sat down and said, okay, the Intertwine is this geography. But for the regional conservation strategy, we got together a bunch of very bright ecologists. And I believe it's Houck 4. In other words, it's based on watersheds. So what we did was we both looked at how can we be nested again so that we're not duplicating what's going on in the Cascades with the Forest Service, so we're not duplicating what's going on up the Willamette Valley, and we're not duplicating what's going on further north in the Puget Trough. And so based on the watersheds of the metropolitan region, that's what defined that boundary for the most part. And the southernmost reach of it was the confluence of the Molalla and Pudding Rivers. That make sense? So there was some logic to it from a watershed perspective. Yeah?
Are the other areas in the United States that you talked about, are they also using the term the Intertwine?
No, that's our brand. We are the Intertwine. Chicago Wilderness is Chicago Wilderness. Houston, they picked that because they knew they'd get people's attention by saying Chicago Wilderness. Are you kidding? And Houston Wilderness basically has copied quite a bit of what Chicago has done. Our relationship with Chicago actually goes back to 1989 when we got money to launch the Metropolitan Green Spaces effort at Metro from Senator Mark Hatfield, who was chair of appropriations, and Congressman Aucoin. Sid Yates in Illinois said that sounded like a great idea. I'll vote for it if Chicago gets half the money. So we have a long relationship with Chicago Wilderness.
All right, we're ready here? Yeah, Mike. Well, they told me I have maybe slightly more than 8 minutes, which is good. I overheard someone was asked me to speak once, was talking to my secretary and arranging it. She's like, 5 minutes. She didn't realize I was standing there. She goes, man, JD can't clear his throat in 5 minutes. So, but I will try to be brief. I'm the director of the Sustainability Center at Metro, and Mike talked about it being the nation's only elected regional government. And I oversee the natural area protection that we're going to talk about, as well as recycling, solid waste reduction, conservation education, our green building programs that we call nature neighborhoods, and a host of things that are designed to protect natural resources and promote sustainability in the region. I'm going to pick up where Mike left off started with the two bond measures the voters here passed. The voters went to the polls, said, yes, raise my taxes so that we can invest money in natural areas, which was an extraordinary act. Neither measure had any organized opposition. Both of them got over 60% of the votes, and contrary to what occasionally conservative suburban folks like to tell me is, no, it did not pass just in Portland, and then the suburbs voted them down. It actually, in both cases, passed in all three counties. And in the last, the 2006 measure, the vote was actually very close in all three counties at roughly 60%. So there's a very consistent consensus among the region that investing in the protection of natural areas is prudent at this point in time. Since those measures also funded local park projects, so a certain amount of money went to each city. The two measures combined, it's roughly $70 million went to the local cities to do things at more of a neighborhood park level. But the bulk of the money was invested in these regional natural areas that was on the big slide that Houck had up. We've purchased a total of 12,000 acres. That includes 110 miles of river and stream frontage, which I think is hugely significant for water quality in the future. We've been actively restoring those properties. We've planted about 2 million trees and shrubs in the last 10 years. Most of that money came in through grant funds or outside sources. A lot of them were planted by volunteers. And we've also opened 3 new nature parks, or roughly 250 acres each. One in Clackamas County that's called Mount Talbert off on Sunnyside Road, Cooper Mountain in Beaverton, and the newest and particularly interesting place, Graham Oaks in Wilsonville, where we're recreating a native oak woodland habitat, which would have been there pre-settlement days. It had been converted, like so much Willamette Valley land, into agricultural use, and we've planted about 50,000 native oak trees there, which are slow growing, and over time a native oak savanna and prairie will reestablish itself there. And meanwhile, there's a really good trail system, and it's a very interesting place in Wilsonville. The challenge, however, is that owning this large portfolio, and we're buying land, we're averaging an acquisition every 10 days. I like to joke that we're running the largest real estate company in the state of Oregon in Metro's basement, completely under the radar of the real estate establishment. And we have a team of negotiators who work on these deals. It's all willing seller, meaning we're not condemning land. We're just out there making deals with landowners whose land is generally not for sale. We're approaching them because we've deemed it to be a high priority for biologic or water quality or scenic or whatever reasons. So we're trying to convince people to sell their land at historically low values to the government. So it's kind of an interesting challenge. But we're doing well enough that we're closing a deal every 10 days. So cash is good. But however, the operational cost, the long-term cost for this portfolio, which cannot be funded with bond money, is going up. And if you've not seen it, it's probably on a webpage somewhere. The City Club of Portland, you all familiar with them? It's a downtown organization that examines issues of major importance. They did a very thorough study of Forest Park that was issued a year and a half ago or something, and concluded that about half of the park health condition was so poor that if there were not quick intervention, that large portions of the park would not survive over the long haul, that much intervention was needed for some pretty significant portions of the park. What we've learned about land management over the years is there's sort of a mythology that, well, Mother Nature will take care of it. You know, if you don't do anything, these lands will take care of themselves. That's just not true. That's just fundamentally false. All of the properties, even the more pristine ones that we're buying, are threatened by various urban adjacent threats, invasive species being the most obvious. Ivy would be the one probably most of you would know. As an aside, when the storm event of 3 weeks ago, or whenever that one hit, there were a number of large trees that fell on Highway 43 between the Selwood Bridge and Lake Oswego that made 43 impassable for 3 days. Virtually every one of those trees that fell on the road was completely choked with ivy. That root system had been damaged, and the ivy actually serves as a bit of a kite, if you will, or a wind. In a wind event, there's a lot more wind that tree will hold, just practical things, besides the fact that the ivy will choke off the entire understory and not create any ground cover for small mammals or food for birds or whatever. And that ivy, if you're not doing something active, it's coming. You can't, if you're doing nothing, then your properties are generally going to degrade. So there's a certain amount of active intervention that's required that we've been doing on our properties. But for us in the city of Portland and state parks who have Triangle Creek State Park, any park provider here or in Chicago or Houston or anywhere else has these same challenges around land management. And the other thing that's a little different is that, and I'll present my own bias as a Metro person perhaps, but the natural area maintenance and habitat protection is, to me, by definition, a regional as opposed to local government issue. Rivers don't exactly worry about whose jurisdiction they're in. I'm not aware of any birds that keep zip codes. The habitat is going to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if those things are being handled differently or poorly or inconsistently in different jurisdictions, you're going to have long-term conservation habitat impacts. And to me, there's a certain economy of scale as well as wisdom in preserving habitat and protecting habitat at a regional level. And that's really what Chicago Wilderness and Houston Wilderness and the coalitions that we're modeling ourselves after are designed to do. Metro owns roughly half of the natural areas in the region. The other half are owned by other local park providers, the largest of which, of course, is Forest Park. That's 5,000 acres that's owned by Portland Parks. And the citizens don't really care that much if it's owned by Metro or Portland Parks or state parks. They wouldn't even know that if they're going to Triangle. Nobody's really thinking about that if they're going to Triangle Park, Creek State Park that's owned by State Parks, or Forest Park or Oxbow Park that's owned by us. And it's not important to people, and why should it be? And yet those funding schemes may be very different. And that's different than, say, soccer, which probably is. Soccer fields are probably best funded and handled locally. There's not really an economy of scale there. There's not, a city's probably going to do a better job there than they may in, say, restoring river habitat or habitat along Fano Creek that runs through 7 jurisdictions. So we've been working on a fairly ambitious and creative plan to fund our natural areas regionally, taking a lot of cues from other places. And there's 2 really dominant models out there in the rest of the country. The one is a single entity focused taxing district. So the East Bay area, there's an East Bay Parks district, and Vancouver, British Columbia has a really extensive regional park system, and that's one entity. They send you your tax bill to your house, you pay it, and they manage all these natural areas. And that's unlikely to ever work for us because it would mean a lot of jurisdictions giving up their natural areas to say Metro or somebody, say Parks, whatever. And the natural areas are a really popular part of people's portfolios and big part of civic pride. Portland Parks, for example, you never read an article about Portland with all this publicity we get nationally that Forest Park's going to be in the first 3 paragraphs of any article about Portland, right? Whether it's National Geographic or I don't know, it's whatever magazine. Forest Park is a huge part of the identity of the city, and asking the city to give it up is just not either necessary or practical. And so the model that we've studied the most are models where you have different entities that own things, but they have a shared funding source. You have a unified, consistent funding that goes out to these multiple land managers. And Minneapolis and St. Louis probably have the 2 best systems in that regard, and they're based on either sales tax, which of course we don't have here, and probably aren't likely to get in my lifetime. You all are a lot younger than me. I'm hoping we'll make it in yours, but it's just my bias. Having grown up like a lot of you somewhere else where that whole sales tax thing makes no sense, or the self-serve gas and other beautiful Oregon quirks. But the politics around creating this regional source, I've been, and my staff been kind of the champions of this. We frankly have run into a little bit of a roadblock in the last 3 months where as we started to cascade out from the park professionals and technical experts and Mike Wetter and Houck and, people have been working with us on this, we began to have to talk to elected officials about it. And it got a pretty resoundingly negative reaction. Particularly in the suburbs, there was kind of a sense that funding natural areas is not nearly as high a priority as police and fire, and there was a concern that any new funding for parks would compete with their local funding needs or potential. There was definitely a fear of strings attached, Metro telling us what to do. Sure, you say you're going to give us the money, but, we don't really trust Metro, and we don't really trust you greenies, and that Houck guy's a little suspicious. And so there was just some sort of classic control kind of trust issues that have come up. And I think one that was pretty powerful was a loss of local identity. I'll use Forest Park as the example, but this was not raised by the city of Portland, who have been relatively supportive of these conversations. But that big natural area in our jurisdiction, that's kind of who we are. That's my identity. I live in Tigard. My identity is Cook Park, or whatever. And they just felt that somehow if it was funded somewhere else that would be watered down, and the creation of the Intertwine and common branding around this would somehow they would lose local identity. I personally didn't think that was well-founded. It was kind of an emotional thing, but, you have to respect people's emotions too and meet them where they are. So where we are now is I kind of look at it as a great idea whose time has not quite come. The day of some sort of regional funding source that's shared across jurisdictions, which, by the way, we did in our bond measures in that local share. That's exactly what that was. That was raised regionally and distributed and implemented locally, and it's worked great and everybody loves it. So I think we can get there. But in the meantime, everybody's general funds are under huge general funds is how most government taxes come in. General meaning they're not dedicated to any particular source, like, say, sewer and water fees have to be used for sewer and water related things. General funds are they can be used for whatever. Those are all declining, and parks often are seen as less essential than police and fire or libraries. And natural areas, the damage to them is not as visible as, say, the community center whose roof is leaking, or the swimming pool, the tiles are damaged, or, the roof that needs to be replaced, whatever. So often cuts in natural areas are common because you figure we can get back to it tomorrow. But the problem with that is, A, you don't get back to it tomorrow because there's another financial crisis. And B, when you get back to it tomorrow, it's a lot more expensive. The ivy you didn't remove today spreads a lot more, and what you might have been able to fix today, the cost of that 5 years from now could expand exponentially. So that's a challenge that we face going forward. The way I try to present this and talk about it is, it's not like the sky is falling and we have to do this, or habitat as we know it will be destroyed. I make the argument that a small investment will yield demonstrable benefits later. It is an investment in real estate, and like any investment in real estate, including fixing the roof at your home, that will save you money. And if you have a small leak in your roof today, maybe doing a little something is probably not that big of a deal. But if you let it go, then it becomes a really big deal. And then 5 years from now, you have wood rot, and the foundation of your house could be impacted because of roof repairs that you didn't make early on, and what might have been a $500 repair now becomes a $50,000 repair because you let it go. It's the exact same thing in maintaining natural areas. And so the thing we're trying to push is a concept of this is a prudent investment that for a small amount, in the grand scheme of public funding, a relatively, say the cost, way less than the cost of one bridge over the Columbia River, for example, like 1/100th of the cost of a new bridge over the Columbia River. You could put all the natural areas here in a fairly optimal functional condition, and then maintaining it at that level once you've restored them is a lot cheaper. So we'll continue to have that conversation and be happy to take questions and thoughts on that. I have no idea how long I ran here. How did I do?
You did fine.
Okay. See, he didn't give me an answer. There was just not a real number.
Again, before we move on to Brent, questions for Jim on financing. Maybe step up to the mic here.
In the multi-entity model with the shared funding source, what's an alternative to the sales tax?
There would be a number. The most obvious one would be property tax, which a lot of districts are. And so it'd be a property tax assessment. The sort of numbers we're talking about, just to put this in reality for some of you, is if the average homeowner paid $30 a year, Forest Park's problems would be solved. We could fund all this stuff very effectively. It's not, we're not talking about $500 a year per owner. We're talking about $25, $30, $35. Metro controls the solid waste stream. We own the landfill in Arlington. There's a great deal of money in garbage. I didn't know that till I got to Metro. It's quite amazing, actually. And there could be a tax on solid waste deposits, so you would pay at the curb when your garbage is picked up, and a certain amount of that money could go to this. That's not really popular, believe it or not, with the solid waste industry, who have lobbyists who wear way nicer jackets and pants than I do, and so that it's doable. The city of Ashland, Oregon, anybody been to Ashland, been to plays there? They have a restaurant tax which goes to parks. I think it's 1%? Not even 1%. Smaller than 1%. Half a percent, third of 1%. But you know what? That's Ashland. Most of the people eating dinner there don't live there. They're from California, and they come up for a play. It's always fun to soak the Californians, but we can't always figure out a way to do that. Apologies to those of you who are from California. Restaurant tax, solid waste tax. There's utility taxes that do go to your water or sewer bill, and on the argument that this is helping habitat and water quality. Those bills in our region are already pretty high. That probably wouldn't be super popular with at least the people that run those agencies. Any tax gores somebody's ox somewhere. Money's coming from someplace, and a lot of those, like rental car tax has been discussed. Well, guess what? All the rental car companies, or a hotel tax, you get the hotel who, so they're all tough. So to me, the question is, what's the most equitable, and what will be the least painful, and what has some nexus to what we're trying to do? And this really has nothing to do with restaurants. So that feels to me like kind of a stretch. It does have to do with property values. We're maintaining these natural areas across the region. It's better for your home. You can walk to these places. Your kids can go to environmental ed classes. So to me, property tax feels, and it's a traditional funder of parks anyway. But we'll look at everything. Thank you. Good question. Anybody else, Leslie? This is going to be hard. She knows a lot.
I just wanted to ask you, I'm real interested in the Southwest Transportation Corridor, and that might be a really good way for Metro, since you're already involved, to get more visibility and maybe actually do some practical things with connecting more green spaces all along that route. And so can you speak to anything that you planned?
Okay, I swear to God, I did not. Leslie and I have known each other for years. She's one of the real founders of the Great Community Gardens program that we have in and around Portland, and has been a great civic activist and very effective professional in her career. But I did not plant this question. The context here is, we do transportation planning out many years in advance, and we're about to embark on the Milwaukee line. The next line that's being considered would run basically down 99 West, or what you might know as Barber, which comes right almost into your campus here, and all the way to Tigard. and then out to Sherwood. And so the idea is that redefining that corridor. And Leslie's question is, well, as we do that transportation planning, are we thinking about natural areas and trails? And we are thinking about it so much so that I have a dedicated staff. This sounds really bureaucratic. I apologize. In the planning of that, we have assigned a parks staff person, Janet Bebb, who you may know actually from Portland Parks, who's formerly with Portland Parks, now works for us, who's really expert on trails and natural areas, is part of that planning team. And are any of you planning students? A lot of you? None of you? Any planner students here? No? Okay. Transportation planning has traditionally, and Michael backed me up here, been done in more of a vacuum around cars and transportation stuff. We're really trying to look at that holistically and really think about just how people live and walking and biking, and certainly water quality and trails become a big part of that. So we're trying to integrate all that planning. It's been getting a really good reception from the community groups in Southwest and the neighborhood associations who feel it's long overdue. And we're bringing the transportation people around. It's a little bit of a cultural shift. We're getting to know each other. We're getting there. But that's a really high priority to Metro, and our elected officials really buy into that as well.
It's interesting you raised that. When current Mayor Adams was commissioner, he was the commissioner in charge of the Bureau of Environmental Services, and he went back to D.C. to testify on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Science Committee, and we sent him back with testimony that basically said, and we also included this in testimony about the surface transportation funding bill, reauthorization bill, that transportation projects need to incorporate green infrastructure to deal with stormwater runoff. And, of course, one of the multiple benefits of green infrastructure for stormwater management is habitat and then the amenities that go with that for human beings. So this notion, and we're not alone, there are many people who are trying to get transportation engineers and planners, systems financing people to realize that there's a consequence of those roads being built, and the projects need to incorporate those kinds of elements.
One quick comment, those initiatives that I mentioned that the Intertwine Alliance is engaged in, one of them is active transportation, and there's been actually a lot of work, and Wetter can comment on this later, in terms of doing more work in Salem to get some of these projects funded.
A couple things that Jim didn't talk about come to mind. In 2000, the City Council was deep into utility rate reform, and the Bureau of Environmental Services brought a proposal to Council that basically took the existing stormwater charge for the city and divided it up into three parts. A part that represented your contribution based on runoff from your property, that would be based on impervious area, the current way we calculate stormwater charges. An off-site charge that had to do with street runoff that would be based on trip generation. So how many trips does your property generate? And that would equate to your use of the public rights-of-way. And then a third leg of the stool was fees to pay for habitat restoration. And what we proposed to council was again, really tiny fees, fractions of a cent on pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, solvents, brake linings, tires and the like, things that show up in the environment that have a detrimental effect, that are part of sort of the urban impact on the environment. And I made this proposal in council, and it was just beyond any reckoning for council. First of all, you had to get legislation passed to authorize these commodity taxes. Then you had to kind of get them passed probably some local referendum as well. So council looked at it as an idea that was before its time as well. So I think Jim's point about keeping the conversation going and waiting for a day when we're sort of in a different place is a wise one. The best thing that we've got going for us is the fact that there's very, very strong commitment to these kinds of activities. So there is hope. Let's turn to Brent.
All right. Hi, I'm Brent Davis, and I work with Ecotrust. I manage the forestry program there and forest and ecosystem services. And our work is really focused on helping to build more resilient and prosperous communities. And I was asked to focus on ecosystem service markets and potential for some of these new markets to help finance the Intertwine. And just to get started, it would be really helpful if I could hear from you, from just even a raise of hands. How many of you know what ecosystem services are? I'm just guessing that most of you. Yeah. Okay, we check. Know what those are. So we don't talk about that.
We are in Portland.
Yeah. Well, we're in Portland. We're here. This is this class, right? This is, yeah. Right. And I also understand that you all are probably out of here in about 15 minutes. Is that also right, or we have an extra little bit? I just wanted to do a quick. Okay. So we know what ecosystem services are. You all probably know about markets. And yes, head nodding what markets, ecosystem service markets are. And okay, because I didn't want to do like a 101 because it's not this class. All right. So you all know that these are new markets, and some of them far more developed and advanced than others. But in thinking about what kind of markets are more relevant to the Intertwine and helping to do restoration and furthering the many goals of the Intertwine to protect, restore, and increase the amount of natural areas within the Intertwine area, what could we do? What kind of markets are really real that we can kind of get into a conversation about and even explore some potential opportunities? So there are markets for wetland mitigation banking. So that's something that is a real possibility. There are wetland mitigation banks that exist, and there could be more within the Intertwine. Again, that's a mitigation, so someone is making an impact somewhere. And if the idea is for a net gain, then we have to make sure that in those banks there is, of course, a net gain. Then there are other opportunities within water quality markets. Again, these are also pretty new and out there, and within the Portland area, that would be something like if there's someone polluting somewhere, could we get them to pay for some benefits to be produced somewhere else? The other market, the market that Ecotrust has done the most work in, that I'm most familiar with, is the carbon market, and specifically the forest carbon market. And so that's the one that I wanted to just give you some quick numbers. Some colleagues of mine and I have been looking at some numbers specific to Portland and what are some real potentials within the carbon, the quantity of carbon that we currently store, and what are the potentials to sequester per year for the next 100 years or so. So if we looked at the targets that the city of Portland has for the quantity of area covered by tree canopy and the benefits that we get from that, and the target is about to increase by about 33%. And if we were to do that and succeed in monetizing the carbon sequestration, the annual carbon sequestration, through carbon markets, and I'm just going to, the most real, the best price that we could actually get would be through the California market that's going to come online really starting in January of 2013 with the passage of the Air Resources Board legislation, the cap-and-trade system within California. Everyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay, cool. So if we were looking specifically at that market, we could, and we did increase the canopy by about 30%, and that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of planting 800,000 trees or more, somewhere in that neighborhood. If we were to do that, we could expect to see an increase in about 10,000 tons of carbon sequestered per year. And if we got $10 per ton, which is pretty good price right now, but probably will be, it's actually going to be the floor price once the California market starts next year. So it's a reasonable estimate to start with. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 a year. And that, this is just a conservative estimate, but that could be for about 20 years. So that's the most real market that I could come up with for the Intertwine, for what we could do now, real projects and have benefits. And one thing I just wanted to really add and to encourage all of you who are thinking about maybe what's next, and that the metrics are so important in these markets. The metrics, how we measure ecosystem services, how we quantify them. It's really tough, and it's a new field, and we need more people in that field. We need to be better at it. There's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot we just don't know. There's a lot we don't know how to measure very well or very efficiently if we're talking about a market where we're going to be transacting money and asking someone to pay us for an ecosystem service and a benefit to the environment. We have a long way to go to improve how we measure things like improvements in land management. How can we calculate where we are now and the benefit after a certain restoration activity? And then, of course, how you put a dollar figure to that. It's easier when someone will pay you. That's how much it's worth. But when we're trying to translate this into some kind of economic value, we know people move here because it's such a beautiful city. If we didn't have the Intertwine, how excited would people be to live here? I don't know. So there's a value there, but putting a dollar figure on it so that people like Jim can go to commissioners and the council and say, we need some money to maintain this because you actually get an economic benefit from this. It's hard right now, and we're working on it, but I just want to encourage all of you to consider that as what's next step. Questions?
I wanted to, don't sit down. I wanted you to go over a bit, under your scenario, what would need to be done, sort of in general terms, in order to register 800,000 trees? What is it? And I think in the previous conversations you and I have had, we've talked about the timing issues associated with this. So could you go into a little bit of what the realities are around this market?
So the Urban Forest Carbon Protocol through the California market is new, and there are very few precedents. So what we would have to do is essentially show that the 800,000 trees that we might plant, there's no law saying that we have to plant those. Is there? No law? Okay, we're good. Because if there were a law saying you have to plant them, then there's nothing, you don't meet the additionality criteria. So you have to qualify for these markets. If someone in California is going to be polluting releasing emissions, so that and what you're doing is helping offset that through your project, then we have to show that this is in addition to what we would have done, or the business as usual scenario, what would have happened without the carbon project. Does that make sense? So we're here, and we've got 3 million trees within the area, and we want to plant another 800 or so thousand. And we wouldn't be able to do that but for the carbon financing. So that's a really important threshold that we have to show. And then the timing, for example, is another important issue if we're talking about combining some of these market opportunities, the carbon market, with projects that, let's say, the acquisitions that Jim is working on. So if we had been working on selling carbon credits along with your acquisitions to fund the restoration, we could have been doing that. Again, these markets are new, and so it's not like we haven't been on it, because they just haven't been really real until very recently. So, but we could say, okay, in the next 10 years or per year, how many acres are you purchasing approximately?
Purchasing about 1,500 a year. 1,500 a year.
Okay, so 1,500 a year. So with those, that's about enough to make a project, to pay for the costs, because these projects, again, they're not cheap to develop, to go through the process, to get a third-party verifier to come out and say this is real and measure your trees now, and then come back every 6 years and measure them again, and measure the growth and figure out if you really are sequestering the carbon that you said you would. So there are real costs associated with these projects, but we could register projects, get projects going with Jim's acquisition, but we would just have to time it such that we have them in the system no later than 6 months is what it is after the acquisition. And so there's all kinds of details that you have to really pay attention to if you're going to do it.
Looks like Mike has something to say.
Well, we don't have much time left, and we're sitting here at Portland State University, and I heard Brent issue a challenge, I think, to some students with regard to our need for more research to get this information. And the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, my understanding is there's an IGRT program, and there are 12 PhD candidates. Is that still true? 25. So, and they're working on urban ecosystem services research. Okay. So I'm just suggesting that there needs to be a really close nexus between their work, obviously, and the topic at hand. And I did find it interesting that not long ago, maybe a month ago, there was an article in the Oregonian that featured Bob Costanza, who I think coined the term ecosystem services, or certainly is a leader in that field. I don't know if Bob's in the audience tonight or not, but he was touted as having helped defeat a dam project in the Mekong Delta. And in the same paper, there was an article about some water users suing the city of Portland for using stormwater fees to do exactly what we're talking about. And the irony of that was incredible. So I'm just suggesting we're very hopeful that this PSU program will provide a lot of the scientific basis and research that Brent needs and the rest of us need to really push the envelope on this issue.
So before folks begin to leave, any questions for any of our speakers? And if you do, come up to the mic and we'll take them as you come. While you're pondering that, I wanted to say a few other things about financial strategies. And one has to do with not creating new revenue, but pushing the envelope on what can be considered capital and then financed through bonding. And the argument that we've been trying to develop at the City of Portland at BES has to do with this notion that when you buy a piece of property, its current conditions may be so that in poor shape that it needs to be brought to a level, a sustaining level, in order for the asset to be realized, fully realized. And then there may be further restoration above that to get to a healthy condition. But there's this sort of in-between condition that we call stabilization. And in the real estate world, you can use capital dollars to buy a piece of property and then make it usable. And all of that can be covered under a bond. So we've been playing around with the same kind of technique and talking to accountants. Now, are there any accountants in the room? Because as long as we're looking for modelers and metrics people, what we really need are accountants to help us make the argument that a certain level of restoration to get to a stable condition for, like, the Riverview Cemetery site that was recently purchased, or for any of these sites that we're talking about, should be covered under the capital program as opposed to the operating side where revenue is so difficult to get. If we can do that, that would be great. There actually is in Europe an exercise underway right now to write new accounting rules that are more triple bottom line accounting rules that would really remarkably change the way money works around natural resources. And if we can achieve that, it sounds really dry and boring, but believe me, the accountants run the world. and in all matters, and so it's one of those areas that you wouldn't cover this necessarily in a natural resources class, but believe me, it's something that needs to be discussed. So, just another thought. Any questions at all? Any questions at all? Yeah, please come up.
I was curious if your revenue stream is quantifiable and fairly predictable. Have you considered creating sort of a futures or an options vehicle to sell the product, so you at maybe a slightly higher interest rate into the future, so you can get the funds now and purchase the land at the good prices?
Well, I'll give you two answers to that. Our bond measure essentially gave us the cash today, and it's there. We don't have to spend it immediately. We've got some flexibility. The last bond took about 10 years to spend out. But $363 million is a significant amount of money to buy land, so we're not cash short there. What a dedicated stream, though, like this district idea that I was talking about, if you knew that you had X cents per thousand, say real property taxes coming in, you could bond against that to make some investments in some parks early on and build some new parks, and then in later years when you spent the money in the early years on development, and then you could spend the money in later years on the maintenance of those parks. So other park districts that have a steady funding stream do those sort of techniques all the time. It's the same way libraries get built, and any number of public assets is invest in the asset in the early years, maintain it in the later years. But that takes a dedicated stream, and right now Moakes Park's funding for maintenance, natural area, comes through a general fund that's completely unpredictable. You're competing with the police and fire. You're competing with, whatever else, which is why we've been working for a dedicated stream. That would give us money to invest, say, in tree planting and take advantage of these markets and other things. Did that answer your question? Yeah, thanks.
Other questions?
They want to go.
So I am interested in hearing more about the institutional arrangements. So we're talking here about managing resources that transcend jurisdictional boundaries. And we have different levels of government involved, the local, regional. We are talking about alliances. We're talking about non-for-profits. So who is playing this convening role? Who is pushing the agenda forward? So what's the process?
I'll go first.
We have two board members here and an executive director.
Yeah, so Mike Wetters, executive director of the Intertwine Alliance. Mike and I are both on the board. The board is made up of a mix of public sector people like myself. There are some pure business persons. There's an executive from Kaiser Permanente. There's an executive from Columbia Sportswear. who am I missing of the business folks? There's a couple others. So the sportswear industry and the health industry in particular have been very interested in these issues. Keen footwear. I think Houck's. You're wearing Keens, right? Those are Keens. You wearing Keen shoes there? Okay, there you go. Keen Footwear, our very own footwear company. The president of that company, who I have a great deal of respect for, James Curley, often says the reason they moved here from the Bay Area was because of the hiking and the opportunities that his employees could go skiing or surfing or hiking, and they located themselves in Northwest Portland near Forest Park, brought those jobs here. And they've gone from 12 employees to 65 in the last 4 years or something, while the rest of the country's bleeding jobs. And so those connections are really important. But the back to the land management, the land managers make those decisions. What's different about the Intertwine Alliance is we're meeting once a month and trying to come up with common practices. And the professionals have met for a long time and shared sort of things that are working, things that are not working at a lower professional level, staff to staff. That communication's always been there. What's not been there is at the chief executive level. And what the Intertwine does is have business leaders, the Portland Parks Director, Mike Abate, myself, the Vancouver Clark County Parks Director, and then advocates in the room like Houck to talk about these issues in an organized forum that has bylaws and discipline and makes motions and passes things. And that's a different paradigm. And it's new. And so like any new paradigm, everybody's still kind of feeling their way a little bit. It'll evolve. And I tend to be a glass half full guy. I think that most everybody naturally wants to do a better job at whatever they're doing. And so we will adopt each other's best management practices and raise everybody's game, because why wouldn't you? And the more familiar we become with those, and the more we help each other find funding, or we're bringing in foundation funding, or we're bringing in federal funding, or we've invented a better mousetrap, a way to save money, or we're taking advantage of new markets that Ecotrust is doing, well, why would somebody not buy in? But it's not. There's no mandate. There's no requirement. It's a completely voluntary organization. They're paying dues. What am I leaving out, Mike's?
Well, one thing, of course, Metro is a fabulous convener, but Metro does not have authority in Washington, and so that's been a long-standing issue we've wrestled with, and we've done a pretty good job of it going back to 89, 90 in terms of, again, this cooperative, voluntary approach. But the fact of the matter is, I can't tell whether I'm being heard on this mic or not, but the fact of the matter is, in addition to making the pie bigger and being more coordinated, another reason for creating the Intertwine Alliance, this structure, is that a lot of us who've been doing this work for 30 years or longer have grown a little weary of every 5 years, or 10 years, we band everybody together, and we have to spend a huge amount of time and energy to get the activation energy up high enough to pass that bond measure. So then Metro runs off and starts buying land, and Portland runs off, and the energy dissipates. 10 years later, time to pass another bond measure. We spend another 2 years getting the energy level back up. We're tired of that punctuated approach, and the idea behind the Intertwine Alliance, in addition to all the other things we've been talking about, is maintaining that energy level at a very high level. So when another park district goes for a bond, we're ready, we're organized, we're ready to go, and we don't have to spend a lot of resources to get to that point. That's another facet.
And by bringing in the business community, you really broaden that reach and speak to people in different ways. Historically, parks were thought of as really nice, kind of cool. Everybody likes parks, but they're not really essential. And then you look at how, say, light rail became, really almost a religion in this town, where the planners and the industry were really tied together in the downtown businesses, and everybody saw the economic impact of light rail, and it became just part of our DNA, if you will, part of what we do. The Intertwine is a intentional attempt to bring that same level of broader buy-in to something we know people care about. People love parks. That's why half the reason people live here. It's not, we don't have to create the emotion or the commitment, but we do need to create a way to tap into the strategy and the coordination that we've not been as effective at as I think we could. And Mike, our ED, is doing a great job, and it's working. The early signs are it's working.
And we should bring Mike up here, actually, if he wants to respond to this next one. Another reason for coordinating with Houston and Chicago and others is that we basically see the Intertwine Alliance as an equivalent of an MPO, that you're familiar with transportation money comes to Metro and gets parceled out through a committee that meets at Metro. Well, we view the Intertwine Alliance as the delivery mechanism to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, EPA, NOAA Fisheries. We see ourselves as we should be the conduit for federal funds coming in, because we are, in addition to helping Metro accomplish its mission, we're actually delivering the mission of a lot of these federal partners as well. So we see ourselves as that conduit. The money may not go through the 501c3 Intertwine Alliance. It may go through Metro, but as a partner of the alliance. So that's a very powerful mechanism, we believe, that depending on how the things go back in Washington, D.C. over the next few years, but there's a lot of potential there.
And from an institutional point of view, that is a very different model than if this had been a Metro-owned and operated regional function with an advisory body like JPAC. And in part, it's out of necessity because we're attempting to do this in Clark County as well as in Oregon, and then of course the Intertwine has municipal members, so they kind of do what Metro does, only it's done in a third sort of nonprofit third party way. So it is a new kind of institution that's being created. Other questions? No? I'm glad you got into the question around federal funding, because most of our discussion has been around local sources, but really it's the combination of coordinated regional planning and then prioritization, and then trying to leverage the different funding sources that is what's powerful about this idea, at least in my mind. If there aren't any questions, then we'll call it a night. And thank you all for coming.